Hi, everybody. My name is Reagan Gale. I'm a clinical psychologist and have had the great pleasure and privilege of working in Yukon for almost 10 years now. I'm very sorry I wasn't able to present live today on this session, More Than Worry. I was really looking forward to chatting with you in the chat box and taking your questions and working through some things together. But sometimes life throws you curveballs, and so here we go. I'm recording this, and I wish I was there, and we're just going to press on. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So hopefully you can see that okay. So I want to start by thankfully acknowledging that the land on which I work and play and from which I'm giving this presentation um, uh, are the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and the many First Nations of Yukon. I pay respect to Indigenous cultures across Turtle Island, and I am grateful for the stewardship and relationship that Indigenous people have with the land. So in this session on More Than Worry, we're going to be talking about anxiety. We're going to talk about what anxiety can look like. We're going to talk about how anxiety can be different and experienced differently by children and by elders. We're going to talk about how trauma and anxiety can be related to each other. We're going to talk about how anxiety can sometimes be helpful, when anxiety can be harmful, when it can get in the way of how we want to live. And then finally, what we can do when we feel anxious. So I'm going to first start by talking about the signs of anxiety. And the first type of anxiety sign, the one that many of us will be familiar with, are the feelings, the emotions we feel when we feel anxious. You might feel nervous or restless or tense. You might have feelings of being scared or even terrified. Some people feel panic. Some people have a feeling of uncertainty, of not being able to settle. Some people feel angry or frustrated or overwhelmed. And so in this way, when we feel anxious, we can feel more than worried. We can feel panicked, we can feel scared, but we can also be angry and irritable as a sign of anxiety. Of course, when we have anxiety, it can also come up and present in different ways. Anxiety can also affect how we think. So I'm going to talk about the thinking signs of anxiety next. For some of us with anxiety, we have anxious thoughts. Maybe you've had thoughts like this before, or you know somebody who's had thoughts like this. I can't handle this. I'm going to fail. Some people imagine the worst and think that that's going to happen. That might be a type of anxious thought. Anxiety can also affect how we think, not just what we think about, but how we think. So, for example, when we are anxious, it's common to have a hard time concentrating and focusing and paying attention. So being anxious makes it harder to pay attention and focused. In the real world, this can also look like someone who's easily distracted by things happening around them. So we talk about that as distractibility, but really that just means if I'm distractible, I'm having a lot of squirrel moments, right? When things are happening around me, they're going to catch my attention. So when I'm anxious, or when people are anxious, we are generally more easily distractible. linked to this, when we are anxious and having a hard time focusing, concentrating, paying attention, when we're easily distractible, it can also be more difficult to remember things because you have to pay attention to something in order to remember it later. So for many people with high anxiety, there are concerns. People will say, I don't, it's hard for me to remember. I'm more forgetful than I used to be. So that's pretty typical in anxiety, especially as anxiety increases. For some people with anxiety, they say that their thoughts seem slower. Their thinking is a bit slower. They feel bogged down. Still, other people who experience anxiety report that it's much harder to make decisions. They can't come to the decision, whatever's facing them. So we've talked about several different thinking signs of anxiety, including the types of things we think about, worrying, I'm going to fail, the worst thing that's going to happen, but also how anxiety affects our thinking. We are more distractible. We have a harder time focusing, which can make it much harder to remember things. Our thinking speed can feel slower or bogged down, and it could be more difficult for us to make decisions. There are also physical signs and symptoms of anxiety. And I bet if we were able to be on the call together and we could manage and chat with each other, one of the things I was going to ask you was, how does your body experience anxiety? Here are some of the better understood physical signs of anxiety, and maybe you'll recognize some of these in yourself. So for some people, when they get nervous or anxious, they start to sweat, right? Maybe they're getting sweaty hands, or maybe they're sweating more in their underarms. Some people get, sweat down their back or their abdomen. So increased sweat can be a sign, a physical sign of anxiety. Some people, when they get anxious, start to feel dizzy. Some people have the experience, they feel like their heart is racing. Some people notice that they feel a little bit wobbly, but some people also can develop a tremor. Maybe their hands shake a bit more, or other parts of their body develop a little bit of a tremor. Certainly more, I'd say more recognized symptoms of anxiety can also be when our tummies get really upset. So some of us feel nauseated. We feel like we might throw up. Our tummy doesn't feel good. When some people get particularly anxious, they experience diarrhea or even vomiting when they get really, really nervous. Anxiety can also change our sleep. So when we're very anxious, we can have a hard time both falling asleep. So we go to bed. It's one of those nights where you lay back in bed and sleep just doesn't come and doesn't come. Maybe you're worrying, you're thinking those worried thoughts during that time. But anxiety can also make it harder to stay asleep throughout the night. So even if we can fall asleep, we might find ourselves wakening through the night, maybe with some of those worried thoughts or some of those other physical signs like that upset tummy or that sweating that wouldn't be normal for us. Another physical sign of anxiety can be a change in our appetite. Often this looks like reduced appetite. So when people are anxious, they're less hungry or less inclined to eat, which can be linked to, feeling sick to your stomach. It's hard to really want to eat when you're feeling like you're going to throw up. But for some people, it's just the opposite. When they feel really anxious, they feel like they need to eat more. Their hunger increases. Maybe they eat more than they planned at a particular time. So these are some of the physical signs of anxiety. Finally, I want to talk about behavioral signs. And what I mean by that is, how does anxiety affect how we behave? So for some people, when our anxiety increases, we use substances more than we would normally or more than we would like. So this can be using more frequently or using in larger quantities than we normally do. And here I mean all the kind of substances that we use that make us to self-soothe or to feel better. So not just some of those recreational substances like alcohol or cannabis, but here I'm also talking about smoking or drinking coffee or tea or eating ice cream. So using substances in greater amounts or more frequently than we normally would can be a behavioral sign that we're experiencing anxiety. Another behavioral sign that's quite common for many folks is when we start to feel worried or anxious, we avoid the thing that we are worried or anxious about. So we maybe avoid the situation that we feel worried about, or we avoid being around the people that increase our anxiety. So we talk about avoidance. When you get really anxious, some of us may want to avoid. Another type of safety behavior that we see with increased anxiety, or sorry, another type of behavior change associated with anxiety would be safety behaviors. So what are those behaviors? Those are the repetitive behaviors that we can sometimes start that really have to do with checking and double checking to make sure that the things we're doing are safe. So in my experience, I've spoken with people who find that they can't ever be without their cell phone, not because they're scrolling all the time or because they want to make calls, but because they're so worried that if something happened, they wouldn't be able to call 911. I've also known some people, and in fact, somebody I just met with the other day checks and double checks her doors and windows 3 or 4 times every night before she goes to bed because she's so worried about something happening in the night. So she checks and double checks. You might think of some other safety behaviors and certainly some safety behaviors are absolutely appropriate and are a way to keep us safe and healthy. But it's just another sign that you may be experiencing anxiety. So now I'm going to chat about what happens when kids feel anxiety. Certainly, for some children who are anxious, they will tell us about anxious thoughts, those things they're thinking about, or they may have those fears or worries. So kids may have fear, they might tell you that they're scared of something, and they might have worries. They might be able to tell you that they're worried about something. But often with children, we also see other ways that anxiety comes up or presents itself. So particularly when we're thinking about children, we often think about irritability. So again, children who are highly anxious may come across as being irritable, frustrated, and angry rather than being afraid or panicked or nervous. But it's still a way that anxiety presents, or how children can show that they're experiencing anxiety, that increased irritability and frustration. Children who get anxious can also have some of those real difficulties with sleeping that we talked about a moment ago. So having a difficult time falling asleep, having some behaviors that maybe seem like they don't want to be in their bedroom at all, right? They don't want their lights out. They don't want their door closed. They don't want to be away from us. But even when they can get to sleep, maybe they're awakening more frequently. They're calling out for us as their caregivers and parents and loved ones in the night more. So difficulty sleeping is both difficulty falling asleep, but also difficulty staying asleep. And in kids, we may see some behaviors that they don't even want to get ready for bed. I'm thinking about my two little boys. I've also had the experience as a mom of having knowing a child who, when they get very nervous and anxious, they really get a terrible stomach ache, right? They feel like their tummy just doesn't feel good, and maybe they also say, "Oh, mommy, my tummy doesn't feel good. I can't go to school today." And so in that, we see the tummy ache, but also some of that avoidance behavior that we talked about a moment ago. So the avoidance, I'm nervous about school, so I don't want to go. I'm going to try to avoid it. But also that physical experience of the anxiety, whether it's a tummy ache, or maybe it's a headache, or maybe there's some other area of pain or discomfort in the body. Also, for children with anxiety, it's not uncommon for kids with anxiety to eat less than they normally would. So not eating as much is another sign. So this is important for us as adults who are caring for and looking after and loving the children in our communities and the children in our lives. We need to remember that anxiety can look different in a young person. It's not always going to be someone feeling nervous or worried or afraid. It can look like anger, irritability, difficulty sleeping, those kinds of things. And now I'm going to talk about anxiety as we get older. So what does anxiety look like in elders? I will start off by saying that it can be more difficult to recognize anxiety as we get older. I'll get to that in a second, explain that a little bit more. But what we do know is that as we get older, our risk for developing a problem with anxiety tends to go up as we age. So as we are well enough and lucky enough to grow over our lives, over our lifespan, we also have an increased risk of having a harder time dealing and coping with our anxiety. And so what are some of the things that play into that? Well, one of the issues is that many of us think that anxiety is normal and that older people just worry more, and that's normal for getting older. That's just a normal part of aging. I'm here to tell you that that's absolutely not the case. And in another presentation that I'll be recording and uploading later, I'll be talking about mental wellness as we get older, and I hope you'll come back and revisit that. Other problems that we have as we get older, we are at a higher risk of developing chronic health conditions and being treated with medications for many of those conditions. For some of the medications that we take, the side effect profile, I'm going to go back in my slides, can look something like this. Some of the medications that we are more likely to take as we get older can also increase our sweating, can make us feel dizzy sometimes, can give us that feeling of our heart racing. And so it can be hard to tease apart, is this elder experiencing anxiety? Is this an effect of the medications they're taking for another condition? And so it can be difficult to distinguish the effects of our medications, perhaps even the symptoms of some chronic health conditions, and those feelings, specifically those physical indicators of anxiety. Anxiety can also be more difficult for us to discuss as we get older because of the stigma and stereotyping and prejudice associated with as we get with some aspects of aging. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the link between trauma and anxiety. Is there one? What do you think? Okay, quick answer, yes, there is one. So what we know is that having an experience of trauma or a trauma history can make it more likely that a person will develop anxiety symptoms in the future. And that can look like all sorts of uh, different types of anxiety. General worries, worries about everything, to specific panic attacks, or even phobias, phobias of particular places or things or objects, or even just social anxiety, worried about being around people. So the link, having a history of trauma, raises our risk for all of these things. Generalized worrying, but also specific worries and worries about being around with other people. That's social anxiety. So why is that? One of the things that we think makes the link between a history of trauma or a trauma experience and developing anxiety is that when we have a history of trauma, it can make it more difficult for us to really calm ourselves, to soothe ourselves, to feel safe in our bodies and in our environments. And so when it is more difficult for us to soothe ourselves, to feel safe, comfortable, when we experience anxiety, we don't have, it's harder for us to have those same other reactions where some other people might be able to calm themselves a bit better, feel more secure to begin with. And so those anxiety symptoms or concerns are experienced at a higher rate. We also know that having had a history of trauma can make it more difficult for us to develop loving, trusting relationships with others, even the people who are closest to us. Having a trauma history can make it difficult for some people to rely on others, even people we love. And so when we have a hard time trusting, it again can make it hard for us to feel safe and comfortable in our environments and our relationships, all of which makes our anxiety experience feel even bigger. But here's a different way of looking at anxiety. I've been talking about anxiety as though it's a bad thing. And certainly in many situations, anxiety can get in the way of us living the type of life we want to live. But here's an idea for you. Anxiety can also help us. Okay, what do I mean by that? Anxiety isn't always harmful. It can help us respond to situations in ways that make us more successful and improve our quality of life. And here's an example from my life. Maybe some of you have had this too. When I have been really, really worried about passing a test, I spend more time studying. So my worry about the test leads me to behavior that helps me prepare better so that I am more likely to get the outcome I want. Or for example, let's say you have an appointment at the specialist clinic, or you have a long awaited appointment and you're really, really worried about missing it. And so you're so worried about missing it that you actually set 2 or 3 alarms, right? You set the alarm maybe on your phone, and you set the alarm in the hotel room, and maybe you ask for a wake-up call from the front desk. That worry, your worry, has gotten you then in that situation to behave in such a way that you have a better outcome. You have 3 wake-up calls, you're going to get to the appointment on time. Anxiety could also help us think about if you knew there was a particular situation that you thought would be risky or dangerous and you were worried about it, and so you chose not to go. that can also help keep you safe. Or let's say it's the first snow and we've all forgotten how to drive on snowy roads, right? Like since last April. So it's the first snow. We know people are driving in erratic ways, and maybe the roads are really icy, and maybe the plows haven't come out yet. And so we're worried about how the roads are. We're worried about how other drivers will be. And so we decide to stay home. That can also help keep us safe. So this is a pretty fancy way of saying it, but I liked this quote, and maybe it will resonate for you too. Anxiety facilitates the avoidance of threat and the assessment of risk. So anxiety can help us by helping us be more mindful of situations that are actually dangerous, and can help us be more sensitive and attuned to risk, and then allows us to respond in a healthy way. So anxiety can be helpful, not always harmful, but certainly it can be harmful, and that's what I'm going to speak to next. So from the perspective of Western Eurocentric clinical psychology, we would say that anxiety becomes a problem when it is bigger or out of proportion with the size of the risk or the threat, or when our anxiety is getting in the way of the life we want to live. So when our anxiety becomes excessive or unmanageable, and it is out of proportion to the true degree of risk, anxiety can get in the way of how we want to live. And that's when anxiety starts to become a real problem. So when our anxious feelings, that nervousness, panic, fear, our thoughts, our thinking changes, but also our behaviors and our symptoms, when those anxiety signs become constant and interfere with our lives, they interfere with our relationships, they interfere with our ability to socialize and work and do the things that bring us meaning, anxiety can be harmful. But then what do we do about it? What I would suggest as a good first step is that the first important thing to do is recognize that we are feeling anxious. Notice what we are feeling, thinking, and doing. Now, forgive me, I'm going to go up in the slide deck a moment. That's part of the reason why I spent so much time going over the signs and symptoms of anxiety. Many of us get stuck on this idea that anxiety is worrying, or anxiety is feeling nervous, or anxiety is feeling panicked. But anxiety can look different for all of us, right? Can look like trouble focusing or concentrating, or memory problems. It can look like increased sweating, difficulty sleeping, not eating as much, eating more, feeling sick to our stomachs. It can look like avoiding people or avoiding situations. So anxiety is more than worry. And that's important because sometimes we can get into a groove, or we can start doing something and not even realize that we feel anxious. So first, recognizing that we feel anxious. Oh, I feel a bit sick to my stomach. Oh, my hands are a bit sweaty. Oh boy, I'm feeling a little bit irritable. All of those might be signs that you're experiencing anxiety. So recognizing first that you're feeling anxious, noticing what we're feeling, thinking, and doing, trying to figure out, what is it that we're anxious about? What is it that my hands are getting sweaty and I'm feeling a little bit sick to my stomach? Is it that I'm worried about doing this presentation? Right. So recognizing that we're anxious, noticing how we're feeling, and then trying to figure out, what is it that we're anxious about? The next step I would suggest is that if that anxiety is getting in the way of how we want to live our lives, we can use a healthy strategy to cope or to deal with it. But remember, some anxiety can be helpful. So my anxiety tonight, about, or this afternoon about this presentation, these butterflies I have in my tummy, the sweaty hands you can't see, my irritability with my husband this afternoon as we were getting closer and closer to this presentation. That actually helped me in a way because it helped me make sure I was prepared and ready and excited to be here with you. So remember that some anxiety can be helpful. A good question to ask ourselves: can we change or control the situation we feel anxious about? If we can do something to change the thing we're worried about, then doing it, then changing the situation can work to turn down our worries or turn down our anxiety. In some situations, we can't change the situation that we're worried about, or there's only a very little thing we can do, and it's not really going to address the bigger issue. And so in those situations, we use our healthy coping strategies and reach out for supports. So how might that look for you in your community and in your life? How do we respond to our anxiety in a way where we don't avoid it, and we also don't pretend that it doesn't exist, but we acknowledge it, and then we make a choice about how we're going to forge our path ahead? How are we going to go ahead in a good way with our anxiety, living with it as it walks beside us? Well, one of the good ways to deal with anxiety is moving our bodies and eating well, whether that's traditional food or making sure that we are getting all of our fruits and veggies, all of those food groups that we need for our bodies to be healthy. Now, when I say moving our bodies, some people will think, well, does that mean I have to start running, or does that mean I have to go to yoga? And that's absolutely not what I mean. Moving your bodies just means that. Moving your bodies, maybe moving your bodies a bit more, maybe walking a bit more, maybe doing a little bit more housework. However you move your body is the right way to move your body. And when we're feeling anxious, just doing it a little bit more is what matters. Not that we have to become athletes, thank goodness, for me anyway. Another healthy way to respond to our anxiety is to get back out on the land, connect with our communities, connect with our culture, connect to the people and beings we love. So connecting with the land, our culture, and with others are all very important and good ways to respond to anxiety. This next one can be challenging. I say this as somebody who once ate 2 liters of ice cream in one go because I was so anxious. It's a long time ago, but I've been there. That's what I'm trying to say. When we're anxious, it can be easy to fall into those patterns of using substances more than we would like. And so being mindful of that and making sure that we're not smoking more, using more cannabis than we normally would or we would like to. Same thing with alcohol and other recreational drugs. Same thing with ice cream, right? Being deliberate in making a choice. Just because I'm anxious doesn't mean that today I'm going to eat all 2 liters of ice cream. Maybe I'll only have a bowl. It's an example from my life. Here are some other things that we can do to respond to our anxiety in a healthy way, especially when there's little we can do to change the situation that we are anxious about. It can be really helpful to use mindfulness strategies and to focus on our breathing, to focus on grounding, to feel our connection to the land wherever we are in the world. What I would also suggest, although I think I said this a moment ago, when it is possible, try not to avoid the situation that is causing anxiety. What we think happens in that situation, we become anxious, So we avoid the thing that we're anxious about that actually turns down our anxiety in the moment. But then the next time the thing comes up, our anxiety will be even stronger still. So, as much as we can, facing with courage the thing about which we're anxious, with supports, and not avoiding it can be a healthier way to responding to our worries and anxiety. Now, reaching out for help, hugely important as well. This might be a trusted advisor, a good friend. It may be an elder in your community. And maybe it's also time, if your anxiety is really high, to reach out to a counselor through MWSU or another counselor in your community. They're here to help. So we've talked about some healthy ways that you could choose to cope with your own anxiety. How then also do we help others, right? I would say that the first step is the same. First, we have to recognize that the other person is feeling anxious. And it's important because as an outsider looking at someone's behavior, we might say, that person's not anxious. They're just being a jerk, or they're being unkind. They're really angry and irritable today. So first, recognizing that some behaviors related to anxiety may look different in your loved one or the person you're worried about. They may appear irritable, they may be frustrated, they may appear to have difficulty focusing, they may be more forgetful, they may be refusing to go to school because they have a tummy ache, for example. So the first step is recognizing anxiety in the other person, being aware that anxiety is more than worry. It can look different. The next thing I would advise or recommend is to ask the person what they need or what would help them. Maybe maybe all they'll want is a listening ear. They'll just want to chat through something with you. Maybe you can help them by making an appointment to see a counselor or connecting them with a land-based activity. Maybe the person might even ask you for help solving the problem or the issue that's making them anxious in the first place. But I would advise against going in and telling the anxious person what they should do, even if it's worked for you in the past. It's always a better starting point to say, what could I do to help you in this situation? What can I do that would be most helpful for you today? It's really important for us as care providers or caregivers or loved ones, as we see the people in our lives feeling anxiety, that as much as we can, we help them get their help, get their own help, support them to seek help themselves, and not take on too much as loved ones, as caregivers. It can be easy to become overwhelmed by somebody else's worries or distress or concern. And to some extent, I think that's in our nature. The tricky part is that if you start carrying someone else's burdens, it's more easy to become overwhelmed by your own. So if you become overwhelmed by providing support to someone who's feeling anxiety, it can be harder to look after yourself. So this is a poem I've long loved. Not a poem. Oh no, I suppose it is a poem that I've loved for a long time. And so I'll just read it to you briefly. If you can sit quietly after difficult news, if in financial downturns you remain perfectly calm, if you could see your neighbors travel to fantastic places without a twinge of jealousy, if you can happily eat whatever is put on your plate, fall asleep after a day of running around without a drink or pill, if you can always find contentment where you are, just where you are probably a dog. And I like that poem because it reminds me to be mindful, to be in the moment. I also think it's important to state that anxiety is a normal part of being a person. It's a normal part of being a human and an adult. I hope this presentation was helpful, was of interest to you. I appreciated the opportunity to speak to you. Like I said, I wish we were able to interact and chat in the chat box. I wish you all the very best in your journeys and in recognizing and coping with your anxiety. Thanks so much.